Hello YouTube, my name is Charlie, and today I'm going to be talking about Blade Runner and its sequel Blade Runner 2049. I'm going to be arguing two things. I will be making a case for Blade Runner 2049 being a cinematic masterpiece, and I will also be exploring whether or not Blade Runner 2049 is a terrible sequel to the 1982 original, as I feel it functions far better as a standalone movie than as a sequel.
Within cells interlinked, within cells interlinked, within cells interlinked.
We're done.
First, let me get this out of the way. Saying that Blade Runner 2049 is visually outstanding is an understatement. In my opinion, this might be the best-looking movie ever made. However, as visual presentation is somewhat subjective, I am going to ignore this for the purposes of this video. I will primarily be addressing the story and the characters presented in both films, as well as how 2049 recontextualizes certain aspects of its predecessor. And secondly, there will be full spoilers ahead for both movies, you have been warned.
There was an escape from the off-world colonies 2 weeks ago. 6 replicants, 3 male, 3 female. They slaughtered 23 people and jumped a shuttle. An aerial patrol spotted the ship off the coast. No crew, no sight of them. 3 nights ago, they tried to break into Tyrell Corporation. 2 of them got fried running through an electrical field. We lost the others.
Before digging into 2049, I'm going to briefly mention a few things from the original movie for context. Blade Runner was directed by Ridley Scott and released in 1982. It is a loose adaptation of Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and it tells the story of Deckard, a retired Blade Runner who is coerced into hunting down 4 rogue replicants. It helped to create the cyberpunk genre with its visually unique and archetypal retrofitted depiction of the future. The plot is relatively simplistic, and the film is generally more concerned with themes and symbolism, which are extremely prevalent. Blade Runner explores questions such as what it means to be human, how memories define who we are, identity, mortality, empathy, moral ambiguity, as well as the search for personal meaning. The depiction of the future also explores many ideas including class division, exploitation, and it presents a distinctly overpopulated and multilingual society. Blade Runner has a distinctly slow pace dripping with atmosphere, with much of the film depicting things that, whilst purposeful and effective with regard to world building, are of no consequence in relation to the plot. It is a film that is absolutely full of ideas and philosophical questions, but it is also not particularly gripping or engaging, at least on first viewing. Ridley Scott states multiple times on the DVD commentary that certain things were put in that didn't necessarily make sense. This no doubt resulted in many unique and innovative details that helped bring the Blade Runner world to life, but it also resulted in many strange, unexplained, and frankly quite weird inclusions. For a film about a man hunting down artificial humans gone rogue, the film spends very little time actually showing this pursuit. The detective work consists of Deckard meeting with Tyrell, discovering a scale in a bathtub, discovering that it is from an artificial snake, locating the manufacturer and discovering the bar owner who purchased the snake, finding and retiring Zora, being attacked by and then retiring Leon, investigating Sebastian's house after he is found dead, and then being attacked by both Pris and Roy. Deckard only spends approximately 41 minutes of the 110-minute runtime doing anything at all relating to the plot, and 5 minutes and 50 seconds of this is him meeting with Tyrell and Rachel. If we also exclude the action scenes, which consist of the 4-minute chase with Zora, the minute-long fight with Leon, the 4.5-minute build-up to and subsequent fight with Pris, and the fantastic 14-minute ending sequence with Roy, Deckard only spends a mere 12 minutes of the film doing any detective work. Blade Runner also spends far too much time on Deckard himself, when the antagonist Roy Batty is an infinitely more interesting character with far more depth, a fantastic character arc, and one of the best monologues of all time.
All those moments will be lost in time. Like tears in rain.
Blade Runner is definitely the kind of film that will grow on you, and it will certainly take multiple viewings to be fully appreciated. It was one of, if not the first, realistic and grounded depictions of a futuristic world in cinema, and whilst its impact on modern culture is undeniable, it is, in my opinion, nonetheless a flawed masterpiece. Blade Runner 2049 was directed by Denis Villeneuve and was released in 2017, which is 35 years after the original. This, in and of itself, is incredibly brave due to the ridiculous pressure and expectations, as the original has such a cult following. Aside from Mad Max Fury Road, it is one of the only sequels to be released after more than 3 decades, and yet still managed to surpass its predecessor. Another similarity between Mad Max Fury Road and Blade Runner 2049 is the equally brave decision to maintain an R rating, rather than watering down the content and almost certainly the quality of the film as a whole in order to appeal to a wider audience. Usually R-rated movies come with significant budget cuts, but Blade Runner 2049 was able to secure a budget of $185 million, making it the most expensive R-rated movie ever produced, and the 82nd most expensive movie of all time, according to TheNumbers.com. Director Denis Villeneuve describes Blade Runner 2049 as an extension of the original, rather than as a sequel, and the movie shows far more of the world than the original did, which took place entirely within the futuristic Los Angeles. Aside from the geographical, the presentation of the world is significantly larger in both scope and scale, which is partly due to the fact that the original only used wide shots very sparingly due to budget and technology constraints, whereas at least 50% of the shots in 2049 are wide shots, which beautifully show off the set design and the lighting. Although both movies feature a detective hunting down a target, 2049 puts significantly more narrative weight on this problem-solving, mystery uncovering than the first movie did. 2049 also has a far greater emotional impact, which, aside from a couple of scenes with Roy, the original was very much lacking in my opinion. There are plenty of new thematic elements such as the conflict between technology and nature, with trees and wood in particular being incredibly rare and yet vitally relevant to the plot, as well as delving into the nature and importance, or lack of importance, of a soul. 2049 also continues the themes of identity, memory, and what it means to be human, but perhaps most clearly it expands on the theme of searching for personal meaning. In Blade Runner, Roy desperately seeks some kind of meaning in his cruelly shortened life. He is unable to achieve this, but his encounter with Deckard ends up giving Deckard both a second chance and a reason to keep going. In 2049, Kay desperately wants to be special, which results in Joy convincing him that he is in fact special. He convinces himself that he is the replicant child that everyone is looking for, and only when he discovers that he is not does he find true purpose.
Dying for the right cause is the most human thing we can do.
The best part of 2049 for me is the relationship between Kay and Joy. Both are artificial constructs, one being a replicant and the other being an artificial intelligence hologram, and yet their relationship is one of the most affecting and effective in cinema. As a replicant, Kay is treated as subhuman by most humans, and yet he treats the AI Joy as if she were human, despite her being even less human than he is. Joy is a product that was purchased by Kay because of his desire to feel some kind of connection and his emotional isolation from the world around him. Although he knows she is nothing more than a hologram, he is willing to lie to himself in order to at least try to be happy. Throughout the film, Joy is able to recognize Kay's desire for physical comfort, and through a prostitute surrogate, they are able to have sexual intercourse. Again, Kay is aware that Joy isn't real, but he doesn't care. If all Kay wanted was to have sex, then he could have hired that same prostitute himself. Kay wasn't looking for a physical relationship, He was looking for an emotional connection.
I'm so happy when I'm with you.
You don't have to say that.
The reason why Joy develops and displays human emotions is because that is what Kay wants. If all Kay wanted was visual eye candy, then that is all Joy would be.
I'm coming with you. If they come here looking for you, they'll have access to all my memories. You have to delete me from the console.
Joy is everything he wants to see and everything he wants to hear, even going so far as to take actions that go against her own self-preservation. For Kay, that makes her real.
I can't do that. Think about it. If anything happens to this, that's it.
Yes. Like a real girl.
The relationship between Kay and Joy mirrors to some degree the relationship between Deckard and Rachel, as Wallace asks Deckard if he had considered whether the reason he was summoned to Tyrell was to fall for Rachel then and there, implying that their relationship in the previous movie was at least partially a manipulation and an experiment. 2049 does essentially answer the question of whether or not Joy's feelings towards Kay were real in this fantastically devastating scene.
You look lonely. I can fix that. You look like a good Joe.
Here, the Joy hologram advertisement calls him Joe, which previously had been the name Kay's Joy had given him after convincing him that he was special, essentially confirming that her entire personality and relationship with Kay was part of her programming. So, unlike the ambiguous replicant question raised in the first movie, the sequel does provide a concrete answer to its own question. However, the more interesting question to ask would be if Kay and Joy appeared or pretended to love each other, does that mean that they actually did? When a simulation becomes indistinguishable from the real thing, does it cease to be a simulation? This very much parallels the topic of identity that is a focus in both movies, the question of whether or not replicants are human, and that if they think and act human, does that in and of itself make them human? Kay and Joy's relationship comes to an end when love destroys Joy's emanator, which destroys both her and her memories. We later see Kay confronted with a, for lack of a better word, soulless, empty shell of the woman he loved. This is exactly the same thing that happens to Deckard after he is abducted by Wallace. Wallace tries to bribe Deckard by giving him a recreation of Rachel as she was 30 years earlier when he last saw her. This Rachel, however, has none of the memories or experiences of the real Rachel, and as such, Deckard is unwilling to fool himself into accepting Wallace's bribe. In a very similar, although less direct fashion, Kay could absolutely simply buy another Joy, but he knows that she will not be the same as she was. Another fantastic addition to the Blade Runner world is the character Love. On the surface, she appears to simply be a remorseless, Terminator-like killing machine dispatched by Wallace to find the replicant child, but there is so much subtlety that makes this character work so well. She is described in the script as polite, efficient, perfect, moral as a tornado, and about as safe. Beautiful, yes, the way a sword can be if it's safely behind glass. She is Wallace's personal assistant, tasked with anything ranging from meeting clients to intelligence gathering to kidnapping and murder. She outwardly appears to admire Wallace for everything he's done to help humanity. He saved them from starvation, he took them to new planets, and he birthed an entirely new line of replicants. Love is special in that she is trusted by Wallace to carry out any task he requires, and he even gave her a name.
I'm here for Mr. Wallace. I'm Love.
He named you. Must be special.
Her goal is the same as Kay's, to locate the child, and her intentions appear to be to recover the child for Wallace. Although he calls her his best angel of all, there is evidence that she both hates and fears her creator, which could suggest that she intends to usurp him when the time comes. One subtle example of this is when Love goes to interrogate Lieutenant Joshi. The very first thing she does is switch on the lights, saying, "It's too dark in here." Wallace's headquarters, where she spends most of her time, are extremely dark and sparsely lit, likely due to Wallace's blindness. The fact that Love tolerates and accepts that shows that she has a far higher level of respect for Wallace than for even a police lieutenant. She appears to show absolute disdain for humans, and she despises Kay because he kills his own kind. She displays a level of sadism towards Kay, mercilessly beating him before destroying Joy's emanator, killing her, and taking away the only thing that gave Kay any amount of happiness. This hatred is very much concealed early in the movie, but gradually as her mental barriers break down, which also mirrors Kay's, her emotions frequently lash out. She is physically superior to all other replicants depicted in either film, and it is strongly implied that she, as a result of being Wallace's best angel of all, is either untraceable, does not show up on any police databases, or has more bluntly been given free rein to do essentially whatever she wants by the powers that be. Later in the interrogation scene, Joshi reveals that she knew that it was Love who had killed Coco and stolen the bones, but presumably she was unable to take any action against her. Love seems to have an innate drive to make others feel wanted, either due to her programming by Wallace, or serving as a means of manipulation to achieve her own goals.
It is invigorating being asked personal questions. Makes one feel desire. Do you enjoy your work, officer?
Here, Love is not so much searching for a connection with others as Kay is frequently shown to do. She is instead pretending to, and attempting to use Kay's desire for connection in order to manipulate him. Love is, however, not entirely emotionally stable, despite being a Nexus 9 replicant. She cries upon seeing the replicant being born, and makes a conscious effort to hide this from Wallace, afraid of displaying any strong emotions that could compromise her. She later becomes visibly distressed and furious after learning that Kay had supposedly killed the replicant child. In her final confrontation with Kay, Love becomes enraged and unstable after she is shot, perhaps at the sight of her own blood and the visual reminder that she is not an angel, she is not special, and she is not immortal. She might be the best one, but she is still a creature made of flesh and blood. Kay lies to Joshi about the importance of the date 6/10/21, and later lies to her again, saying that he successfully located and retired the replicant child. Love additionally tells Joshi that she will lie to Wallace and claim that Joshi attacked her, forcing her to kill Joshi. Both Love and Kay demonstrate that they are capable of internal, private thoughts and feelings. They are not simply processing information and spitting it back out again, as a computer would do. They are very much conscious in the same way that we consider humans to be. They may outwardly act in a subservient and somewhat robotic manner, but they are absolutely capable of formulating their own ideas, opinions, and desires. Another less appreciated factor that makes 2049 so great is that it tells the story it needs to tell and nothing more. Denis Villeneuve was originally against the idea of making a sequel to the original, but he was convinced after reading the script. In a decade where cinematic universes are popping up everywhere, and in quite literally all but one instance they are failing miserably, it is extremely refreshing to get a sequel that is not only fantastic in its own right, but it also doesn't waste a moment of time setting up anything in the future. As Blade Runner did 35 years earlier, 2049 tells the story it wants to tell without any thought as to what may or may not come next. In order to properly examine where 2049 succeeds or fails as a sequel, I'm going to provide some criteria that can define a great sequel. This is, of course, to some degree subjective, but I will be giving examples of films that either succeed or fail at each of these to try and keep things both clear and fair. And I will also be giving my thoughts on how Blade Runner 2049 either fits into these criteria or fails to. Number 1, a sequel should continue the story and events from the original. When people want a sequel, they frequently want to see the same characters doing something new. One clear example of this being done expertly is in The Dark Knight, which takes the established character of Bruce Wayne from Batman Begins and gives him an entirely new threat to deal with in the form of the Joker. Direct references to the events of the first film are extremely sparse, but one of the reasons The Dark Knight functioned as a fantastic sequel is because it was built naturally on the character of Bruce Wayne that was developed in Batman Begins. An example of a sequel that fails to do this would be something like Jason X, which is set in space for some reason, and it really has absolutely nothing to do with any of the films that came before it. 2049 does certainly build on the events presented in the original, but not in terms of the primary plot. Deckard's hunting of Roy Batty and the other rogue replicants is never mentioned, and 2049 instead builds on the relationship between Deckard and Rachel. A common criticism of 2049 is that the parents of the replicant child should have been anyone other than Deckard and Rachel, and that the film should have omitted them entirely, which is a fair point as their inclusion does retcon many elements of the original film to varying degrees, which I will be going into. Number 2, a sequel should not be a remake of the original and should explore new ideas and characters whilst remaining faithful to its predecessor. The best example of this has to be James Cameron's 1986 masterpiece Aliens. Despite being an almost entirely different genre to its predecessor, Aliens manages to explore new themes such as motherhood and introduces us to many memorable new characters. Perhaps helped by the fact that Ridley Scott's 1979 original was very small in terms of scale, there was plenty of room for Cameron to build on the universe presented without ever contradicting anything that Ridley Scott had set up. It is extremely rare for a sequel to succeed in an entirely different genre to its predecessor, but Aliens might be the best example of this. There are multiple examples of sequels that simply remake the original and are rightfully criticized as a result. Some of these include Star Wars The Force Awakens, Predator 2, Airplane 2, Toy Story 3, The Mummy Returns, as well as pretty much every Saw and Paranormal Activity sequel. Staying close to the original doesn't always ruin a movie, but it is almost certainly a detriment. Blade Runner 2049 excels here. It is not so different from the original as to be classed under a different genre, but many elements of the presentation are refreshingly unique. Denis Villeneuve has described 2049 as being created from the same palette as the original, but being very much painted by a different painter. The visual and sound design in the first Blade Runner were extremely iconic and probably the most recognizable and influential aspect of the film. 2049 cleverly does not aim to copy this aesthetic, and it instead creates an entirely new ambience which is more of an evocation of the original than an attempt to recreate it. It does not simply copy and paste famous iconography from the first movie for the sole purpose of evoking nostalgia. One of the most famous unanswered questions in the history of cinema is the question of whether or not Deckard is a replicant himself. Throughout Blade Runner, Deckard is presented as a human who at times suspects that he might be a replicant, but depending on which version of the film you watch, the conclusion is ultimately ambiguous. In Blade Runner 2049, we learn in literally the first scene that Kay is a replicant. A major plot point involves him suspecting that he may be the first ever child born from another replicant, making him essentially suspect that he may be more human than he was led to believe. This is a very clever spin on the original, as it neither tries to replicate the same ambiguity, nor does it simply disregard the question altogether. I have seen multiple criticisms of both the sound design and the visuals as being unfaithful to the original, and of having too much of their own distinct style. This is certainly a valid complaint, as the presentation in 2049 is pretty unarguably not particularly similar to the presentation in the original. Where Blade Runner was dark, smoky, and cluttered, 2049 is vibrant, sleek, and minimalist. However, part of this visual disparity can be explained by the first movie taking place in 2019, with the sequel being set 30 years later in 2049, so these are not supposed to be back-to-back sequels. Number 3. A sequel should not undo the accomplishments or events of the original. Thankfully, the vast majority of sequels get this one right, but a perfect example of how to break this rule is with the most recent Star Wars movies from Disney. Return of the Jedi concluded the original trilogy with the Empire suffering a major defeat with the deaths of both the Emperor and Vader, and the destruction of the second Death Star. The Disney trilogy has completely undone this off-screen in the 30-year in-universe gap between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens. The First Order has risen up somehow and has unfathomable resources, despite the Republic being in control of the galaxy after the fall of the Empire. Luke has gone from being willing to sacrifice his own life to redeem his mass-murdering father Anakin into a depressed hermit waiting to die and inexplicably willing to murder his own nephew in his sleep for crimes he had yet to commit. Additionally, from the trailer for Rise of Skywalker, it is beginning to look like the Emperor might not have actually been killed after all. So this really is the perfect example of how to undo the plot and character conclusions of the previous films. And even if Star Wars Episodes 7 through 9 had told interesting stories, they would still have been irredeemably tarnished by this critical flaw. 2049 manages to avoid the risk of undoing much of the first film, largely as a result of not being directly linked to its main plot. Much of what we are shown is a natural evolution on what came before. We are told that after the events of Blade Runner, replicants continued to be violent, which led to their prohibition. This was resolved when Niander Wallace was able to create improved and supposedly emotionally stable Nexus models. 2049 also continues the visual symbolism of eyes, with the opening shots in both movies being extremely similar. We are also shown that the pollution and environmental degradation from the first film has become far worse. Interestingly, the writers chose not to bring back the iconic Voight-Kampff test from the original.
1187 Hunterwasser.
That's the hotel.
What?
Where I live.
Nice place?
Yeah, sure, I guess. Is that part of the test?
No. Just warming you up, that's all.
Instead opting for a more advanced and more intense baseline test. Whilst the Voight-Kampff test existed to detect if a person is a replicant, the baseline test appears to be used more as a means of measuring deviance, stress, or other unwanted mental abnormalities in replicants that could be problematic. It is also interesting to note that as replicants became more normalized and commonplace in society, the level of hostility rose alongside. The Blade Runner universe depicts almost an uncanny valley effect, in that the more human the replicants became, the more hated they were. The technology to detect the replicants also seems to have developed faster than they did, which made it harder for them to hide.
It was unclear what she was. At least to someone. This was a test. We were difficult to spot then.
So 2049 doesn't really undo much from the original, but it does abandon certain ideas and it does not build on the core narrative from the first movie. Number 4. A sequel should take the established characters on a new journey without rewriting their personality. One of the best examples of this has to be Terminator 2: Judgment Day. In the first Terminator movie, Sarah Connor was a fairly unremarkable and ordinary young woman. Throughout the film, she is forced to change drastically as she is hunted mercilessly by the titular killer robot, and by the end, she is a fundamentally different person. This is a conclusive and complete character arc, but what Terminator 2 does so brilliantly is that it takes this change in character and ramps it up even further during the decade-long in-universe gap between the events of the two films. In short, James Cameron wrote Sarah Connor in such a way as to have her grow realistically off-screen, from a traumatized waitress into an absolutely iconic badass and very slightly mentally unstable warrior woman, which sets her up to grow even further during the events of Terminator 2. So in other words, this is pretty much the polar opposite of what happened to Luke Skywalker off-screen between Return of the Jedi and The Last Jedi. Although both Sarah Connor and Luke Skywalker evolved off-screen into very different people than they were the last time we saw them, in the case of Terminator 2, it is written so as to be convincing, logically consistent, and realistic, and in the case of Star Wars, the writing appears to have been constructed to be the exact opposite. Blade Runner 2049 does expand on the character of Deckard, but not necessarily the same Deckard that we knew from the first Blade Runner. In an early scene, Kay meets with Gaff, who strongly implies that Deckard is a replicant. We never get a concrete answer for this in 2049, but Gaff clearly believes that Deckard is a replicant.
Sure wasn't long for this world.
Also,
Something in his eyes.
Here he is referring to the shortened lifespan of the older replicant models and the distinctive glimmer in their eyes. After the events of Blade Runner, Rachel became pregnant and subsequently died in childbirth. Before Rachel gave birth, Deckard planned with Fraser, the leader of the underground replicant movement, to go into hiding, deprive himself of any information about the child, and allow the child to live anonymously, free from any threat of becoming a science experiment. The idea of the Deckard we knew from the first movie joining up with a group of replicant freedom fighters is somewhat hard to swallow. Deckard punishing himself by living in isolation from the outside world is an idea that I think works given the character from the first film, but the idea of the almost nihilistic, reluctant manhunter working with replicant freedom fighters for the greater good is something of a departure from the character we knew. Additionally, the excuse cannot be made that his character developed off-screen over the 30-year in-universe gap, because 2049 asserts that Deckard did all of this in the year 2021, a mere 2 years after the events of Blade Runner. Deckard's primary purpose during 2049 is really as a plot device. He doesn't have a huge amount of agency, and he is moved from one location to another by other characters. This is by no means character breaking, but I would also not describe it as a natural evolution of the character of Rick Deckard. Number 5. A sequel should not retroactively change the meaning of events from the original. If an event is ambiguous or not directly addressed due to it not being relevant, then adding meaning or explanations in the sequel can absolutely make sense as a way to build off the first movie without contradicting anything. A good example of this would be the entire premise of the most recent Planet of the Apes trilogy. How the apes came to take over the planet is not a question that is relevant to the story being told in the 1968 original, but had it been established in the original that humanity had killed themselves off in a nuclear war, then it would not have been appropriate for this new trilogy to provide an alternative, unnecessary, and contradictory explanation. This is an area that I think 2049 fails in. 2049 implies that Deckard and Rachel fell in love the moment they met, which was very much not the case in the original. They were openly hostile to each other until after their aggressive and slightly uncomfortable sexual encounter. 2049 also implies that the reason Deckard was brought out of retirement by Bryant, the reason he was assigned to hunt down Roy Batty and his cohort, and the reason he was summoned to Tyrell Industries was so that he would fall for Rachel then and there and ultimately impregnate her. It is worth pointing out that this is taken from dialogue from Wallace to Deckard in an attempt to convince him to give up the location of his child, so it is entirely possible that Wallace is lying to Deckard. If Wallace is telling the truth, however, then this absolutely does not sit well next to the plot of the original movie. There are also far easier ways to test if a replicant can become pregnant than manipulating two people into falling in love. I have seen more than a few people critical of Blade Runner 2049, and it is of course their right to criticize whatever they want. Where a line must be drawn, however, is between the statements, "I don't like X," which is subjective, and X is bad, which is objective. So, when someone says, "I don't like the cinematography in Blade Runner 2049, they are absolutely within their right to express that opinion. The problem with opinions is that everyone has one, and they can somewhat limit discussion because I could simply respond by saying, well, I liked the cinematography in Blade Runner 2049, and then the conversation hits a brick wall. A frequent criticism of 2049 has been that the plot and character motivations are inconsistent or do not make sense. This, conversely, is an objective statement that is either true or false and can be supported or refuted with evidence from both movies. I am now going to take some time to refute the claims that Blade Runner 2049 does not make sense. In cases where I'm responding to specific videos, these videos will be linked in the description. One last thing before I start, I think it is important to note that although 2049 is somewhat open to interpretation as far as who Rachel's child really is, the movie heavily implies, and the intention from the script was clearly, that Anna is Rachel's daughter. There are multiple theories of varying validity that argue that Kay, Love, Wallace, or Mariette may actually be Rachel's child, but to keep this video as focused as possible, I will be working on the assumption that Anna is Rachel's daughter. How can a replicant be controlled with fake memories if they know they are fake? This complaint was raised by Rob Ager in his video Blade Runner 2049 Plot Fails. In the original film, Tyrell explains the purpose of his experiment with Rachel.
We began to recognize in them strange obsession. After all, they are emotionally inexperienced with only a few years in which to store up the experiences which you and I take for granted. If we gift them the past, we create a cushion or pillow for their emotions, and consequently we can control them better.
Memories. You're talking about memories.
She is implanted with memories in order to provide a cushion to her emotions, thus making her more stable, more real, and more human. This only relates to controlling her in an indirect manner. Tyrell's ultimate goal was to create replicants that were more human than human, hence the need for memories. Ager also highlights that making the replicant aware that the memories they have are implants, and thus not genuine memories, inherently contradicts the purpose of the memories being implanted. Whilst I agree that this is a reasonable conclusion, it does assume that Kay was told that his memories are implants by the Wallace Corporation as a matter of protocol, which would absolutely be contradictory. Given that replicants are depicted very much as second-class citizens, routinely abused and degraded, I don't think it at all unreasonable that someone, a colleague, a boss, some guy at a bar, could make Kay aware of the falsity of his implanted memories simply as a way to dehumanize and insult him. In the original Blade Runner, Rachel is unaware that her memories are implants and is equally unaware that she is even a replicant. Her discovering that her memories are implanted is a major part of her character arc, but this is only plausible because no one, except Tyrell and later Deckard, knew that she was a replicant. Replicants with memory implants did not become widespread until after the events of the first movie. Given the treatment of replicants in this futuristic society, we might wonder why the Wallace Corporation would bother giving their replicants implanted memories at all, if they are inevitably going to be revealed as such. As this is pure science fiction, we really don't know the details of the process of creating a replicant or implanting it with memories, but I would say it's reasonable to assume that memories of some kind serve a purpose in the development of the replicant's mind. We see that these replicants are born as fully grown adults, and as the goal of the Wallace Corporation is to create a disposable workforce that is as human as the purchaser wants them to be, it would not make sense for them to simply leave the newborn adult replicants with a blank slate for a brain. It is also important to remember that replicants are not robots, they are artificially grown people, and an army of artificially grown, emotionally unstable amnesiacs are not going to make particularly good workers. What we do know is that Tyrell developed Rachel specifically with memory implants in order to cushion her emotional responses. The Nexus 6 replicants depicted in Blade Runner displayed very strong emotions and were consequently very unstable. There are multiple examples of this.
Let me tell you about my mother.
The Nexus 9 models depicted in Blade Runner 2049 were built specifically by the Wallace Corporation to obey and do not exhibit the same levels of instability. It can be reasonably assumed that Wallace continued to implant memories in his replicants after Tyrell's success with Rachel. Again, this does not make the Nexus 9 replicants robots, as there are key moments when their emotions get the better of them.
Dreadfully.
Do you like being separated from other people? Distinct.
Distinct.
Dreadfully distinct.
Dreadfully distinct.
Dark.
Dark.
Within cells interlinked.
Within cells.
You can't hold the tide with a broom. Except that I did. I do hope you're satisfied with our product. Where is he?
Cells interlinked.
Within one stem.
Within one stem.
And dreadfully distinct.
And dreadfully distinct.
Against the dark.
I love you.
Against the dark.
A tall white fountain blade.
A tall white fountain blade.
You're not even close to baseline.
The replicant revolution makes no sense because there are human slaves too. This is another criticism raised by Rob Ager, and this one is simply a flawed argument. Just because the replicants are not the only slaves does not invalidate their desire to not be slaves. Wallace outright states that humanity lost their stomach for human slaves, and yet we are shown in the orphanage the children are forced to work on a production line. They are also apparently sold regularly for use in other establishments. The reason for this manufacturer using children instead of replicants is likely that a child slave does not cost anything. This establishment is not located in the city. It is situated in the waste processing district located amongst mountains of garbage in the ruins of San Diego, and it is made very clear that this is not a legal, upstanding operation. If the establishment could not afford replicants and had easy access to children, then it would make perfect sense for them to enslave the children instead of buying a few hundred replicants. It is unrealistic and unbelievable that a replicant giving birth would or could lead to a revolution. Rob Ager provides a list of reasons here, including that the only people we know for certain witnessed the birth were Sapper Morton and Fraser, although there may have been others, and that such an unrealistic, unprecedented, and seemingly impossible story would be unverifiable hearsay. This would be a valid criticism if not for the historical precedent for unrealistic and unbelievable stories becoming legends or in some cases religions, given the right circumstances. If the right person, someone truly charismatic and inspirational, believes that they witnessed a miracle, it is not a stretch at all to accept that they would be able to convince others that this miracle really happened. I have also seen multiple critics state that regardless of the believability of the premise, it is unclear as to why a replicant uprising would be anything other than a mild inconvenience for humanity. To explain this, I'm going to give a few facts about the replicants in 2049. They are significantly stronger than humans. They are at least as intelligent as humans. They are extremely widespread across the planet and off-world, although the only number we're given is millions. Previous models have been born with artificially limited lifespans. They have been hunted and exterminated, made entirely illegal, and are routinely abused and treated as second-class citizens. Jokes are made about them eating children. They are viewed by most as things rather than as people. Even the act of killing them is not referred to as such, they are instead retired. Then, a rumor starts to spread that a replicant has successfully given birth. This introduces the possibility that replicants no longer need humans to procreate. Given everything we know about replicants, I consider it dishonest to say that a very long and very bloody war between humans and replicants is anything other than a distinct possibility. The reason this is a problem for the human population is that the replicants are being used as tools to fulfill a job. They are not treated as equals because they are not seen to be equals. They are designed, manufactured, and sold as products in the same way you would buy a computer or a car. The closer the replicants come to being the same as humans, the more likely the replicants will demand equal treatment. If a computer or a car realized it was capable of autonomous reproduction, then I'd consider it absolutely believable that it could inspire revolt, or at least the desire to be seen as equals. The movie answers the previously ambiguous question of whether or not Deckard is a replicant himself. This criticism is raised by Rageaholic in his video, Blade Runner 2049 is bad and you should feel bad. I should point out here that if accurate, this would only potentially make 2049 a poor sequel as opposed to a poor film, as without the context of the original and the endless debating as to Deckard's true nature, this would simply not be a flaw at all. Rageaholic makes the case that 2049 makes very clear that if replicants are able to reproduce autonomously, then it could cause major problems for humanity for various reasons. Rageaholic asserts that if Deckard is a human, and he impregnated Rachel, a replicant, this would not be a big deal. Whereas if Deckard is also a replicant, it would mean that a pair of replicants have truly replicated without any human intervention. I feel that 2049 maintains the ambiguity as to whether or not Deckard is a replicant in a few ways. We are shown early on in 2049 that Wallace is frustrated by his inability to make fertile replicants, and we are explicitly shown this in the context of a newly born female replicant. The visuals and Wallace's dialogue heavily imply that the problem of fertility lies specifically within the female. We are also told that Rachel was developed by Tyrell to be the first replicant able to conceive a child. Additionally, the human female reproductive system is significantly more complex than the male reproductive system, so it is definitely not unrealistic that Tyrell and Wallace would have been able to create fertile males and yet struggled to create fertile females. Therefore, the fact that Deckard impregnated Rachel does not answer the question as to whether or not he is a replicant, because it is irrelevant to Rachel's ability to conceive a child. It doesn't make sense that replicants are unable to reproduce when they are supposed to be artificially grown copies of humans. This criticism was raised by Michael Snow in his video Blade Runner 2049: A Pale Imitation, and is valid in some ways but invalid in others. So in the original Blade Runner, Tyrell was responsible for creating the first replicants and for developing future versions. Neither the original film nor the sequel makes clear as to whether or not he is the only manufacturer, but given his standing, I think it's reasonable to assume that he was the guy making the breakthroughs, even if there were competing manufacturers. Due to science fiction techno-jargon, the earliest replicants were not able to reproduce. This is not explicitly explained, but again, I find it reasonable to believe this premise given that until Rachel, maybe, all manufactured replicants had an artificially limited lifespan and were born as fully grown adults. This can also be hand-waved upon the realization that replicants never experience puberty as a result of their life cycle, and thus never have a properly developed reproductive system. Regardless of whether or not you find this argument convincing, what we know as a fact is that it took Tyrell multiple revisions of the Nexus replicant model to create a fertile female. This makes logical sense if you can accept the premise that the original replicants were not, for whatever reason, able to reproduce. You can argue that due to the premise of a replicant being an artificial person, that all replicants from day one should have been able to conceive a child, but if so, that really is a position that can't be argued against because it's speculation into the specifics of biological design in a science fiction movie, so I will move on. The plot twist is only a twist because the film misdirects you by having the characters be stupid. This is one of multiple criticisms I'm going to address from ER's video Semi Blade Pillar 2049. This first criticism is targeted at the mystery of the replicant child. During his investigation, Kay starts to believe that he himself may be the replicant child he is hunting. In order to confirm or disconfirm this, Kay visits Anna, a memory maker employed by Wallace, to find out whether or not his memories as a child in the orphanage are real. ER argues that in the previous scene, where Kay locates a toy horse that he had a memory of hiding in the orphanage, and the fact that this toy horse both exists and was in this exact location should confirm to Kay that his memories are real, although they may still have been implanted and are therefore not necessarily his memories. Therefore, instead of asking Anna if his memories are real, he should have asked Anna if his memories were his. Essentially, ER's criticism is that Kay knows his memory of the toy horse actually happened, and yet he asks Anna if the memory of the toy horse actually happened. So earlier in the scene, Kay directly asks Anna,
"Are they all constructed, or do you ever use ones that are real?"
Suggesting that implanting real memories into a replicant is not common practice. Anna then confirms this by stating that it is illegal to do so. Given that Kay has physical evidence that at least part of his memory took place, and has now confirmed that the memory makers do not implant real memories into replicants, the only conclusion Kay can draw from this is that his memories are in fact his, meaning he must be the son of Rachel. Only then does he ask Anna to confirm if the memory actually happened, and she confirms that it did. ER does acknowledge that this at least makes sense, but it is a little convoluted and it could have been clearer, which I would agree with. When broken down in this way, it is clear that this scene is written ambiguously so as to set up the twist later down the line.
You imagined it was you. Oh, you did.
However, I would argue that although manipulative and misleading to the audience, the questions asked by Kay and the responses given by Anna are consistent with their characters, so this is not a "Your Honor, my client would like to plead temporary insanity" moment. Kay should have asked Anna to check his other memories to confirm if they are real or not. ER also argues this point, and whilst this sounds reasonable, I would like to offer an explanation as to why he didn't. Kay had previously checked the date 6/10/21 from the toy horse for births and located twins, a boy and a girl. He has already confirmed that the girl is dead, and he previously had memories of being in the orphanage, which led him to reasonably believe that he is Rachel's son. This means that he is not approaching Anna from a non-biased perspective. He is already very much convinced that he is Rachel's son. He simply needs the final nail in the coffin before he goes on the run and is hunted by both the police and Wallace Corporation. After Anna confirms that the memory is real, Kay says,
"I know it's real."
He already knew. He just needed to be 110% sure before signing his own death sentence. Anna doesn't reveal to Kay that the memory is hers. ER's third problem with this scene is that Anna views the memory and confirms it as having really happened, and yet she does not reveal to Kay that it is in fact her memory. ER suggests that Anna had no reason to be ambiguous in her answer to Kay, and that the only reason she didn't tell him the memory was hers was so that the plot could happen. This, indeed, appears to not make a huge amount of sense, but upon doing some research I have found two somewhat conflicting explanations. One popular explanation is that Anna is aware that she is Rachel's daughter, and therefore a replicant, and that she was lying when she said her parents were off-world. She is working for Wallace and intentionally providing him with real memories of her own childhood so as to create red herrings as he searches for her, suggesting that Kay is not the only replicant with her real memories. Wallace is obsessed with finding Rachel's child to unlock the secret of replicant reproduction, and if multiple replicants mistakenly believe they are all Rachel's child, this would make it very difficult for Wallace or anyone else to confirm which replicant is actually the one they are looking for. The reason why she cries upon viewing this memory is because she realizes that Kay is essentially living a lie, and that he will likely be hunted and killed, and that his memories were put there to manipulate him. The other popular explanation is that Anna is afraid of being caught breaking the law. She does not know that she is Rachel's daughter, or even a replicant. She is extremely vulnerable and has to live inside a protective bubble. She has had very few interactions with anyone, and it appears that her job as a memory maker working for Wallace is pretty much the only thing she has. As she states in the scene with Kay,
What makes your memories so authentic?
Well, there's a bit of every artist in their work. It feels authentic, and if you have authentic memories, you have real human responses.
here she makes clear that she is fully aware of the value of using elements of genuine memories in place of fabricated ones, in spite of it being illegal to do so. It is not beyond the realms of possibility that she slipped in a few real memories, or more likely parts of real memories, in amongst the fabricated ones in order to make them more authentic. She then sold them to Wallace, who was none the wiser, and she is now confronted with a replicant police officer who has been implanted with one of her memories. The reason she cries is that she is viewing a traumatic memory from her own past, and perhaps also because she is scared of being caught. The reason she doesn't tell Kay the whole truth is because she has no reason to. He is one of presumably many replicants implanted with either the exact same or similar real memories from Anna, and given the illegality of using real memories, her position as a contractor of Wallace Corporation, and Kay's position as a police officer, it would definitely not be in Anna's best interest to tell him. This explanation, I think, holds up to scrutiny far better than the first, but again, I will concede that 2049 could have explained a little better why Anna didn't tell Kay the whole truth. Blade Runner 2049 has a woman problem. This criticism is taken directly from MovieWeb's video of the same name, and in the video he is highlighting that multiple critics pointed out the apparent sexism and misogyny in 2049, and MovieWeb then further argues and explains the points they make. Before responding to the points he raises, I should say that even if 2049 is sexist, that does not make it a bad movie, or a bad sequel. Regardless, I feel it is unfair and reductionist to call 2049 sexist, so I will go into each of his points now. 2049 fails the Bechdel test. This is the first point MovieWeb raises, and I am not going to respond to this because the purpose of this part of the video is to analyze and respond to valid and substantive criticisms of the movie, so I don't want to waste time explaining why the Bechdel test is insurmountably flawed. All of the women fall into some kind of male fetish archetype. This criticism is also raised in MovieWeb's video, and again, I think it's an extremely reductionist comment to make. He describes how all 4 female leads fall into this category, so I will respond to each of these points. Joshi is a sleek, whiskey-drinking, dominatrix-like authority figure. So, Joshi is Kay's boss. She is a lieutenant at the police station. She is the one who gives Kay orders, and he is therefore subservient to her. She appears to both value his skills as a detective, but also clearly does not consider him to be a person. Upon seeing that Kay has been injured on the job, her response is,
"You're hurt. I'm not paying for that."
The most interesting scene with Joshi, however, is when she visits Kay at his apartment. She helps herself to Kay's alcohol and orders him to tell her a story for her own entertainment.
I feel a little strange sharing a childhood story, considering I was never a child.
Would it help you, Sheriff, if I told you it was an order?
She compliments him, if only in a backhanded way.
You know, I've known a lot of your kind. All useful, but with you, I sometimes forget.
She makes sexual advances towards him, which he rebukes, and this clearly irritates her.
What happens if I finish that?
Shouldn't I get back to work, madam?
Everything Joshi does in this scene is with the goal of getting laid. She is attempting to wrap Kay around her finger and to use him as a sex toy. What is interesting here is that, given Kay's predisposition to obey, she could no doubt have got what she wanted from him. She clearly does not care about Kay as a person, and yet she seems to respect him, if only as a tool that is good at its job. She later allows Kay 48 hours to disappear after he claims to have successfully finished his mission, in spite of the fact that he had quite spectacularly failed his baseline test and was showing clear signs of distress and deviance. Joshi essentially saves Kay's life when she could have quite easily had him retired then and there. She later continues to protect Kay by refusing to divulge any information to Love. She deliberately provokes Love, and this ultimately ends with her own death. So, with all that said, if the only thing you took away from this character is that she is like a dominatrix, then I would like to be so bold as to suggest that the only sexist here is you. Love is a femme fatale in heels, flirtatious and murderous, and randomly kisses Kay. I explored most of this earlier in the video, so I won't repeat myself here too much. Love is Wallace's best angel. She is his personal assistant whom he appears to trust and value above all others. We are given no reason as to why Wallace would want Love to be unattractive, which is why she is depicted as seductive, charming, and dangerous. Joy is a purchasable AI girlfriend whose entire personality revolves around Kay. This point I resent simply on principle. This is the entire point of her character. This was a deliberate move. This was the premise for some of the film's biggest philosophical questions. The idea of buying an idealized virtual girlfriend whose only purpose is to be everything you want to see and say everything you want to hear is of course inherently misogynistic, and it is supposed to be. Depicting sexism is not the same as condoning sexism. Anna is a damsel in distress living in a literal glass cage. This one is slightly hard to argue because Anna functions almost as the MacGuffin for the movie, a chess piece to be fought over. I would argue against her being in distress, but I can understand calling her a damsel. All I would ask then is that if Anna was a male and named Andy, would anyone be condemning this as either sexist or anti-men? So really, I think this just comes down to people looking for things to be offended by. I think part of the reasons for these criticisms of sexism is that all 4 female leads are physically attractive, so I'll quickly explain why this was necessary. The entire purpose of Joy is that she is a virtual girlfriend, so it is absolutely necessary for her to be attractive. And Love was designed by Wallace to essentially do his bidding, so again, it is totally reasonable that Wallace would want her to be physically attractive. Joshi did not necessarily need to be attractive, or even a woman, but as I went into a few minutes ago, the dynamic between Joshi and Kay allowed for some of the best character-driven scenes in the film. Yes, Joshi could have been a character similar to Bryant in the original movie, but then 2049 would have had to waste time explaining why this overweight, balding, middle-aged man is trying to have sex with Kay. And finally, Anna is innocent, childlike, and vulnerable, and is supposed to be the first ever replicant child, the object of desire by every faction in the film. Her being female is relevant due to the heavily implied problems with female replicant fertility, which I discussed earlier. So yes, she could have been depicted as a disfigured, fat, hairy man, but this would have contradicted the other information we have about her. Plus, at the risk of sounding sexist, people generally want to see attractive people in movies, and there is nothing wrong with that. There is a reason why the vast majority of successful actors are conventionally attractive. 2049 is inherently sexist for bringing back Harrison Ford's Deckard but not Sean Young's Rachel. This confusing statement is the final criticism I'm going to address from MovieWeb's video, and I will try my best to unwrap it. MovieWeb argues that the 75-year-old Harrison Ford is presented as a sensitive, gun-toting brawler capable of trading punches with Ryan Gosling's replicant Kay, whereas Sean Young's Rachel is demoted to a memory, having died off-screen between the two films, despite Young being 20 years younger than Ford. MovieWeb seems to be arguing that Blade Runner had two leads, and that by only bringing back the male, this inherently makes the sequel sexist. This is, again, extremely flawed, so I will give a few quick reasons as to why this is not the case. It is hinted at in the original that Rachel only had a limited lifespan, and 2049 avoids this question by having her die in childbirth. So either way, she would almost certainly have been dead by the year 2049 in-universe, regardless. Rachel also has a significantly bigger impact on the plot of 2049 than Deckard, despite not being physically present. Had the film instead set up a different replicant as being the one who gave birth, Rachel would have absolutely no place in this story whatsoever. And this one is slightly more meta and not something I personally care about, but I think it's valid to highlight. Harrison Ford is a more bankable star than Sean Young, and Deckard is a more memorable character than Rachel. Bringing back Deckard makes some degree of sense, and it was integrated very naturally into the plot of 2049. Rewriting the film to include Rachel would have necessitated an entirely different script. So to conclude on this point, although she had a huge impact in terms of setting up the events of 2049, Rachel simply did not have a part to play in this story, and I refuse to concede that that makes this movie sexist. It is unbelievable that Kay is unable to beat Love in hand-to-hand combat when he was previously able to beat Sapper Morton. This is an argument I have seen more than once, and it simply does not hold up at all. Here are a few reasons why. Sapper was a Nexus 8, Kay and Love are Nexus 9 models. This in and of itself is a sufficient explanation. Whilst Sapper was a combat medic turned farmer, Kay is a Blade Runner. It is literally his job to hunt down and kill Nexus 8 replicants. Love is Wallace's personal assistant, so it's reasonable to assume she is not a production line model and has had plenty of modifications. After all, he did name her. Love only beats Kay because he was seriously injured going into the fight, and she later surprises him with a knife. It is reasonable to assume that Kay deduced that the orbital bombardment that saves him in San Diego was orchestrated by Wallace. So, why then would Kay lead Wallace to the orphanage? This plot error was raised by Jeremy from Cinema Sins, and I know what you're thinking. Why am I taking Cinema Sins' criticism seriously? This will likely be surprising, it was to me, but Jeremy highlighted 4 valid logical inconsistencies or flaws with 2049 that I felt were worth responding to. The other 112 sins in his video were either not flaws, were vague conveniences, or I think were supposed to be jokes. So here's my explanation. Kay goes to the orphanage because of the DNA records indicating that 2 people sharing the same DNA lived there, and 2 people cannot share the same DNA, leading Kay to conclude that one of the 2 never existed or was being hidden. All Kay knows at this point is that he is being followed. He might suspect that Wallace is behind it, but he really has no idea who or why. So it would make sense for him not to do anything rash, such as run away. There is no condemning information in the orphanage, and Kay had no reason to suspect that there would be. At this point, he suspects that he might be the child he's looking for, but he has kept this a secret from everyone else. From the DNA records, all he knows for sure is that someone scrambled them to cover something up. He does not know who, what, or why. Therefore, Kay entering the orphanage does not and could not reveal any information whatsoever to Love, Wallace, or whoever else he may have suspected of following him. If Love was tracking Kay's every move via Joy, that would mean she would know about his meeting with Anna. This is somewhat difficult to discuss due to a lack of specifics on the futuristic technology, but I think it reasonable for me to simply say that Jeremy is wrong. We see Love notice that Kay's Joy has been switched off after he deletes her from the console and, along with her memories, uploads her to the Emanator. Joy is a piece of software that exists on a console in Kay's apartment. We are shown that once Kay breaks the antenna of the console, Love is alerted and is no longer able to spy on him. The movie is not telling us that Love is using Joy to spy on Kay, The movie is telling us that Love is using Joy's console to spy on Kay. The film never addresses whether or not Love was able to spy on Kay when he was not in his apartment and was accessing Joy via the Emanator. Whilst I would consider this possible, especially given that Love is aware that Kay owns an Emanator, it is equally possible that her spying is simply not possible when the Emanator is switched off. Therefore, it's not reasonable to assume that Love would be aware of the meeting that took place between Kay and Anna. Why does Deckard explain his history with Rachel and the child to Kay? Jeremy points out that the secret of the replicant birth is the most secret secret in the history of secrets, and yet Deckard spills the beans to Kay without needing much persuasion. So try to view this scene from Deckard's perspective. He has been living in isolation for years. He has taken considerable measures to ensure he is not discovered, and yet Kay is smart enough to find him. Kay is a replicant Blade Runner who is clearly physically superior to Deckard, and yet allows himself to be punched repeatedly in the face. When they finally sit down and talk, the following conversation takes place.
You two live here together?
Too many questions. I had your job. I was good at it.
It was simpler then.
Why are you making it complicated?
Why don't you just answer the question?
What question?
I didn't figure you as one for bullshit.
Deckard does not immediately answer Kay and has to be repeatedly poked before divulging any information. The only information he does provide is that Rachel was the woman he loved, and that he deprived himself of any further information regarding their child so that he could not be compelled to divulge it. None of the information Deckard reveals to Kay is of any direct help, so even if Kay had intended on retiring the replicant child, Deckard couldn't possibly have been of any help to him. I do think it's interesting to highlight that this scene is very reminiscent of both the Voight Kampff scenes from the original Blade Runner, as well as the baseline tests from this one. The scene is primarily an interrogation, and both Kay and Deckard display intense emotions as Kay tries to understand what happened. It is only after Kay persists and demands that Deckard says Rachel's name that Deckard finally complies, and he whispers the name of the mother of his child who had died 30 years earlier, a name he likely thought he would never hear or say ever again. Why does Love not kill Kay? Jeremy's fourth and final, somewhat valid criticism is that in two separate instances, Love physically overpowers Kay and yet does not finish the job. In the first scene, she chooses to let Kay live after destroying the only thing he cares about, leaving him physically and mentally broken. Yes, it may have been appropriate to put a bullet in Kay and finish him off, but her destruction of Joy, in her eyes, accomplished the same thing. It is also entirely possible that she either doesn't like to, or was programmed not to, kill other replicants, unless directly ordered to do so, as the only scene when she kills another replicant is when Wallace orders her to execute the Rachel clone. In the second scene, she once again physically defeats Kay and mortally wounds him with a knife. Again, she may have finished him off had Deckard not been in imminent danger, but her priority, either of her own volition or as ordered by Wallace, was to extract information from Deckard, who at this point was very close to being drowned. So to conclude, I'm going to list off some of the reasons why 2049 is a bad sequel to Blade Runner. We are told in 2049 that Tyrell had planned for Deckard to impregnate Rachel in order to produce the first replicant baby. This is a retcon of what we are shown in the original Blade Runner, and it revises their entire relationship as being at least somewhat manipulated by Tyrell. Rachel is entirely repurposed for 2049. In the original film, Rachel is built by Tyrell as an experiment to cushion the emotional instability of the Nexus 6 replicants. She is the first replicant implanted with real memories, in this case the memories of Tyrell's niece. In 2049, she is repurposed as being an experiment in replicant fertility, manipulated into being impregnated by Deckard. These two things do not contradict each other, and it is entirely possible that Tyrell was running multiple experiments simultaneously, but it is definitely a stretch that he would be experimenting with both memory implants and fertility on the same replicant at the same time. This clumsy storytelling could have been avoided if the pregnant replicant was not Rachel and was an entirely different replicant Tyrell had created for this specific purpose. 2049 recontextualizes Deckard as something of a rebel fighting for a cause, or at least being involved with one off-screen between the events of the two films. The soundtrack is somewhat evocative of the music used in the original, but it would be a stretch to call it faithful. Certain elements of the world building from the first movie, such as the futuristic and multicultural city-speak dialogue spoken by many characters, is entirely absent from 2049. There are still plenty of indications of a multilingual society, but the language itself is almost entirely in English. The tone of 2049 is drastically different. The original is very dark, depressing, and hopeless, and ends with Deckard and Rachel on the run, and the film makes relatively clear that this is going to be short-lived. Conversely, the third act of 2049 involves Kay making a heroic sacrifice for the greater good, and the film leaves off very optimistically with the imminent replicant rebellion. And finally, 2049 is unnecessary. This one is a bit less a flaw with 2049 as a sequel, so much as it is a flaw with criticism of stories in general. Yes, the original Blade Runner tells the story it needed to tell, and although it did end with something of a cliffhanger, it was not a cliffhanger that strictly needed a resolution. Blade Runner 2049 is an entirely new story that takes place in the same universe as the first film and acknowledges the events that took place, and both films feature the character of Deckard. So whilst 2049 is conclusively unnecessary as a sequel to Blade Runner, it is absolutely necessary as a movie because it is a fantastic work of art in and of itself. If sequels were only made because they were necessary, we would not have movies like The Empire Strikes Back or Terminator 2 Judgment Day, because Star Wars and The Terminator told complete stories on their own. Arguably, 2049's biggest flaw is that it is a sequel to the 1982 Ridley Scott film. Given the very disappointing box office return, it is extremely unlikely that we will ever get another Blade Runner film. But then again, the original also had a very low box office return, and yet after 35 years, Denis Villeneuve gave us a more than worthy follow-up. So, who knows, maybe after a few decades, this movie will have the same cult following as the original. It is my firm belief that 2049 surpasses the original in almost every way. Although it does feature a couple of one-dimensional characters, some occasionally blunt dialogue, and arguably manipulative writing, and whilst I would not quite call it the best sequel of all time, it is certainly deserving of a spot on the podium. Well, if you made it this far, all I can say is thank you so much for sticking around, and I hope you found this video interesting and entertaining. If you enjoyed the video, liking, sharing, or subscribing will help me make more videos like this in the future. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in my next video.